Greetings, and welcome to this, the fifth and final lecture in a series of lectures on the subject of extemporaneous preaching. In today's lecture, I want to talk about writing sermons. As we've gone through this course, you may have been surprised by how much talk we have had about writing and the importance of writing. And yet, writing sermons is at the heart of the extemporaneous experience. And you would know that if you remember the definition of extemp preaching that we're using in this class, that I read during that first lecture. In that lecture that I mentioned that extemporaneous preaching definition of one of the things it talked about was the elaborate preparation that goes on, and often the writing of a full manuscript. Well, today I want to talk about writing manuscripts for sermons. It's important. It stands at the very heart of how a sermon is created. And so we'll spend a lot of time today and in this final lecture talking about it. Whether you've been preaching for a lifetime or just starting out in the ministry, you have written manuscripts out in full. It's part of the process at the seminary, and most preachers, when they start out, do this, write their manuscripts and preach them by reading them. So you know how to write manuscripts. I don't have to talk much about that, but there are some things about writing for an extemp delivery that I do want to share with you today. And I want to start by just talking about why you need a manuscript for an extemp delivery. First of all, the number one first thing is that writing a manuscript is a very creative process, and you cannot cut that out of the whole experience. Martin Luther put it this way. He said, "The sermon is conceived in the study and born in the pulpit." I think that's a terrific way of putting it. It's conceived in the study. It's put together. It is created, basically, in the study. And then it is delivered, and there it is given birth by your delivery. So it's very important to have to be able to write down what you have come up with for ideas of sharing in a particular text and so on. By writing it down, you have this possibility then of sharing it in full with people when you deliver it. And it's when you write it down that it takes on some kind of an effective form. Number two, writing helps give a sermon focus. By writing a full manuscript, your sermon has the chance of becoming and being very focused. If you don't write anything down, if you're just going to try and remember things and then speak them freely, you just aren't going to be able to keep a focus in your sermon. You begin in some ways say the same things over and over again. And if you don't write it down. My doctor of ministry advisor, Michael Rognes, said, "Yeah, you have the danger of becoming a gas bag." And I think it's a pretty good way of putting it. If you're going to just wing it every Sunday and try to speak freely, it's powerful to do that in some ways, but the danger is that you'll just keep starting to say the same things over again, the same way, and so on. This is not possible when you speak in extemporaneous mode, because you've written it down, and you go over what you've written down, and you don't have to worry about the danger of saying the same thing over and over again. The third way, a reason for writing a full manuscript out, is that it clarifies. By writing, you can clarify and edit what you put into your sermon. A good example of this is when I had a story I wanted to use in a sermon one time, but every time I had told that story, I realized somewhere in the middle of telling it to someone that there were some offensive things about it, the way I was telling it. And so I very much wanted to use that story in the sermon because it fit. but I did not want to offend anybody. And so I wrote the story out in full, and I edited out all of the offensive things that were in there. And then I ran through it in my rehearsals the way I had written it. And I was not telling the story when I told it in any offensive way at all. And it worked out perfectly because I was able to edit it and get it properly on paper. And then I was able to take what was on paper through the oral rehearsals and speak it freely, using somewhat different language perhaps, but always the same meaning. And this is a very important thing because there are many pastors who are afraid of this speaking freely business because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're going to get up in the pulpit and say the wrong thing. And that is a real possibility if you're just winging it, if you're doing impromptu kind of preaching. You could say the wrong thing and probably often do. But when you use the extemporaneous system, where you are running through it as what you wrote, and presumably what you wrote is not offensive, then what you say will not be offensive. After 40 years of doing this, I have never said anything from the pulpit that would embarrass me. I've never said anything that I didn't want to say. I might not have said it exactly as I'd written it, but because I've written it and edited it, and it's all, been gone through, I never said the wrong thing. You just don't, because you know what you want to say. You have it written down. Number 4, it increases the likelihood that your exegetical work will actually make it into the sermon. One of the things about when you're doing your exegetical studies of the text, it's important to write things down as you go. All week you're writing. You're not just writing the sermon, the final sermon. You write all week. You write things down as you think of them and as it comes to you. And as you work on the sermon, you're writing things down. You're taking notes. And those notes are what you finally put into a written document. So writing is part of it from the very beginning. And it's really where you get the content for your sermon. And if you don't do that, you risk not remembering what you thought of earlier and not getting, and it won't get into your sermon. So it's extremely important to get these things down on paper that you thought of so that they will enter your sermon when you finally do the final writing. I've talked to some impromptu preachers who have taken my class, and they said, oh yeah, well, what I do is I think about something, I just keep repeating it over and over again all week in my mind. I just keep saying it to myself. Well, that probably works, but it's so difficult, and it's so time-consuming, and there's certainly a danger that you would forget some things. So I think it's just so easy and so makes so much sense to write things down during the week and then write them down in the manuscript form at the end. A 5th way or reason for writing a manuscript is because it's important to have a hard copy of your sermon. If someone, say you preach at a funeral, and someone asks you for a copy of your sermon, if you have just spoken freely or winged it and didn't have a hard copy, you wouldn't be able to give them a copy of your sermon. And that's something nice to do. So, and other sermons, Sunday sermons, I've had people ask for some copies of Sunday sermons, not very often, but once in a while. And so it's nice to have a hard copy of it so that you can give a copy to people. It may not be that you've written it in such a way, that it would be suitable just the way you have it. But with computers, we can just go through and fix it all up and take out your numberings and all the things that you might have had in there. And it would be suitable for giving to someone. A second reason for having a hard copy is that you use the manuscript to guide you when you do your run-throughs. If you don't have a manuscript when you're doing your run-throughs, you have nothing to work on. You don't know what it is you're wanting to say. So you have to have a manuscript to do your run-throughs and to guide you in the sermon presentation. And also, it's there for you to write on. It's there for you to take notes, put things down that maybe you come up with on the spur of the moment as you're doing your oral rehearsals. You need something to where you can write it down, where it goes in the right place on the sermon itself. And that's why it's important to hit the space bar a lot, and or the return key, I guess you'd call it now. It enables you to open up the sermon so that you have room to write things in. You don't want the sermon to look like a page on a book. You don't want your manuscript to look like a page on a book. You want it to be open and have some room for putting things down. The sixth thing is you can prepare ahead. You can write your sermon on Wednesday and have it ready, and after an hour to an hour and a half of rehearsal on Sunday morning, you can speak it freely. If you don't have a manuscript, you can't do that. And the occasion for that comes up quite a bit because you have Saturday weddings, you have other things on Saturdays sometimes where you can't get to writing your sermon, or you know you're going to be gone for a weekend or part of a weekend, so you want to have it done ahead of time. You can just get it done and then pick up your manuscript. You have to have exactly what you want to say is on the manuscript, and after you've run through it a few times, you're able to say it freely. Number 7, and lastly, it's good to have a copy of your manuscript for your records. This will enable you to use the sermon again in a future parish, maybe not exactly that sermon, but a version of it. You can get ideas from it. I used to have a whole file of Christmas sermons, and I would go back and maybe find an illustration that I used in a former parish 20 years ago. And that's a helpful thing to have. You might just find illustrations if you're having to do devotionals or something, and you might want to go back and find some illustrations for a particular text. You can go back and look that up and find it. In fact, other storage methods other than a hard copy are somewhat suspect, to say the least. I have many sermons stored on floppy disks. Young kids don't even know what floppy disks are, but there's a couple different kinds of them. I don't have a computer anymore that even plays them, so it's worthless. And I suppose the cloud, we can say, well, that's always going to be there, but who knows? If you have a hard copy and you have it on file, it's a good thing. Well, after you have completed writing a faith statement and a purpose statement, the next thing to do is to work on an outline for the sermon. And this is a very important thing whenever you're writing anything. You write an outline. It gives you steps of what you're going to be presenting. I came up with a type of outline for process preaching that I call the process preaching flow chart. And there's a copy of this in my book, but you could come up with something like this yourself. It's not a hard thing to do. It's basically something that you can use for an outline. Now, in my case, I put up in the title, up in the top left-hand corner, I put the date, and then I write in the text. What is the text that you're going to be preaching on? And then down at the bottom, I have a spot where I can put the purpose statement and the faith statement, so that each of those statements are right in front of me there when I'm working on this. And then I have an area over here that I call the elements, where I'll make notes to myself about maybe illustrations or stories that I want to include in the sermon, or other things that I've discovered in my exegetical work. And then there's the blocks. Each block in those squares I'll put how the sermon is going to flow. I'm going to retell the text in the first block. Second block I'm going to, well, that's pretty standard way. But let's say in the first block I'm going to tell a story about my grandmother. In the second block I'm going to relate that to the text. And then the third block I'm going to talk about how Grandma's love still shines in my heart, just like the Lord's love shines in my heart, or whatever. So it's a way in which you can outline the sermon. And I write all over that thing. I don't just stay in those boxes. Sometimes it's just solid with stuff. Different things that I've come up with during the week. And it's just a very helpful thing. Then there's no magic number of blocks that you need to have on that, or that you need to fill in. Maybe if you only had 2 sections or 2 blocks in your sermon, it probably wouldn't be enough. But you don't want to have more than 5 or 6 either. It starts getting a little too complicated. So you want to have these blocks and arrange them so that you have a flow to the sermon, so you know what you are going to transition from one to the other. Now, this is what you use then to write your sermon, so that every minute that you spend working on a flow chart or an outline is a minute that you won't be spending writing the sermon, because you know where you're going and you know what you're going to be putting in there. This is extremely important to do that, to have some system of outlining your sermon before you start writing it, so you know where you're headed and how you're going to get there. Question I'm often asked is, should I preach from my manuscript or should I preach from an outline? Some students think that have said, well, maybe after I run through it, then I should just take some notes from it and then preach from the notes. That's not necessary, nor is it advisable. Your manuscript are your notes. You're going to preach from your manuscript because you have written everything down on your manuscript. You have blocked things out. And your brain, as I've mentioned before in this lecture series, your brain remembers where things are on the page. And so you want to make sure that you use it for your run-throughs. And then, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of using that manuscript that you used for your rehearsal in the final delivery process, because the brain will actually remember where on the page to look for things. Top of the page, middle of the page, bottom of the page. And then again, remember that people don't mind if you have a manuscript. As long as you don't read it, it's just there to guide you. And it's a very comforting thing, I think, when you're first starting out in this process, to have a manuscript and not have to worry about whether or not you're going to remember things, because they're all there. You can look down and see what comes next. And as long as you come back to the people after you've checked your manuscript, they don't mind. And then just a few comments about writing in general. A lot of things have happened in my lifetime for writing that are just unbelievable. The advent of the computer and word processing changed everything in the church as it did everywhere else. And writing sermons became so much easier. In the old days when I was typing on a regular typewriter, if I wrote something, I wasn't ever going to change it. I couldn't change it, because I would have to retype the whole sermon. In those days, I was reading my sermon. So there was no way you could alter things. And now you can just change things around, and it's so easy. It's such a wonderful thing. It really is a gift to the church. If somebody said, I suppose if somebody said to a logger that he could no longer use a chainsaw and he had to go back to using an axe, he'd say, well, then I'm not going back. Well, it's the same with me. If you said I have to go back to the ministry and preach, but you're going to have to type out all your sermons and it will take the computer away from you, there's no way I'd ever go back. It's such a blessing. And it's a great thing. So writing manuscripts is so much easier than it ever has been. And one of the things that when you're writing a sermon, it's important to remember that you don't need to carefully craft every sentence. This is not something you're going to publish as the way it is anyway. And so if you spend all kinds of time carefully crafting every sentence, then you have wasted time. In fact, if you're going along and you can't think of how you're going to say something, you might want to just kind of put something down that is generally speaking what you want to say and then go on, because you're not going to say it the way you wrote it anyway. You're going to say it differently. So why take all kinds of time to carefully craft? So use that skill when you're writing devotions for the newspaper or something. That's a skill that's important, but it's not something you use in writing manuscripts. Then I have a couple of stories to finish this whole series that I enjoy telling about writing and preaching. Several years ago now, I was watching the Emmy Awards, and they were giving the awards for best writing. And the person who was introducing this whole area got up and talked about the importance of writing. And then he finished with a saying that I hadn't heard before, but which must be very popular among the theater people in that group. He said, remember, if it's not on the page, it's not on the stage. Isn't that good? If it's not on the page, it's not on the stage. And in the case of preaching, if it's not in the manuscript, it's not going to be in the sermon. It just isn't. It has to be there. You have to write things, put them down. Then what interested me more was that they started giving out the awards for writing, best writing. And they came to best writing for a situational comedy. And the Fraser show, won. You can tell how long ago this was. They won for it. And the writers came up to the stage. They flooded the stage. There were 12, 14 writers that came up. And I thought, it takes 12 or 14 writers to write a half-hour sitcom, maybe, 25, 30 of them a year, half hour. And then it was time to give the writing award to the best late-night TV show. And Jay Leno won. And again, 12 or 13 people came up. Well, what are they writing? His monologue? That many people? I mean, I guess there's other stuff, but mostly the only thing that would take any writing is the monologue, just interviews and that kind of thing. And even the Conan show had 10 writers, and I thought, oh, man. So I took a couple of things away from this. First of all, it's not easy to write. Writing is a tremendously difficult thing. And especially not easy when you have to do it every week and you have to come up with something creative and dynamic or inspiring or whatever. Parish pastors have some of the toughest assignments of writing in the whole country. You might have people who have a daily column maybe in the newspaper or something, but the most difficult and the most challenged writers in the country are pastors who have come up with something every week to inspire people. And then it also demonstrates the importance of writing. And truly, if it is not on the page, it is not on the stage. It's the absolute truth. And one more story, and this story is it came about because my kids know that I was a fan of the old MASH movie. I was a chaplain during the Vietnam War in the Pacific, and MASH came out when I was there, and it was just the best. So they gave me a copy of the 25th anniversary of this movie several years ago. And in it, they interviewed a lot of the people who were in the movie. And they had a long interview with Robert Altman, the director. He was the first director in this movie to allow people to ad-lib and to impromptu say things that weren't in the script. He just gave them free rein. He said, you know, you come in the room, here's the line that we have written for you, but you can say what you want and how you want to say it. And these actors, who are just terrific at this, just in their impromptu speech, came up with spectacular stuff. Well, the screenwriter, the guy who wrote the thing, saw this in some footage that he was watching, and he said, well, that's not what I wrote. He's not saying what I wrote. And Altman said, well, yeah, but it's actually better than what you wrote, and it's more spontaneous. And besides, you know, the guy says, well, then what good am I? And he said, well, if we didn't have you, we wouldn't have a story. You wrote the story, and without it, we have nothing. So be happy about that. Well, then the Academy Awards came along, and MASH was nominated for like several, but the only one that won was the one for original screenplay. So this guy gets up and thanks everybody, but he didn't do any thanking of the people who had rewritten many of his speeches that he'd written for the play. So it's just amazing. And that changed everything, by the way, in movie making. And from then on, they have allowed directors regularly allow people who are in these sitcoms or whatever to do their own ad-libbing when they come up with things that are better than what is written. I want to say something in conclusion about inspiration and the Holy Spirit. I'm sure that when you have been writing sometimes a sermon, you are amazed by the fact that you come up with this stuff and that you actually have something to share on Sunday morning after all the research and study and hard work. I've sat down more than once to work on a sermon and said, I have nothing on this subject. I have no idea what I can write about this. But after sitting there and staring at the computer screen for a while and working on a sermon and doing the research and so on, I've come up with something every Sunday that I've had to preach. And sometimes it's probably decent, sometimes it's not so good, but I've always come up with something to try and inspire the people. The only answer for how that's possible is the power of the Holy Spirit. It's the Holy Spirit working in us, inspiring us to write these things and to come up with these illustrations and the ways of talking about the gospel. And it's a tremendous power. It's a power that is amazing. And it happens to us in the writing process. And the Holy Spirit is with us there. And the Holy Spirit is with us also if we stand up and try to deliver it freely. The Holy Spirit is there to help us. I really believe that. And I think that that's key to this whole idea of being able to speak freely in the extemporaneous mode. Michael Rogness makes a good point when he writes this. He says, and I want to close with this quote, "The obvious solution to avoid reading sermons is the worst solution, not write the sermon out at all. There are occasions when we may not have time to write a sermon out in full, but those should be rare. For long-term growth and improvement in preaching, there is no substitute for careful preparation of a manuscript. Pastors who skimp on writing inevitably skimp on preparation, and despite whatever native ability they may have, they soon become shallow and trite in the pulpit. The challenge is to write the sermon well, then deliver it well." And so I want to end with that. And thank you for sticking with me through all of this. This has been a very unique experience, and I'm doing it here at my lake home, where I have been retired for almost 16 years now. And I did enjoy it. It was fun trying to do this, and I hope that it means something to somebody. Thank you again, and the Lord bless you in your ministry and in your preaching.